Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
So, you're most well known for your book, The Power of Stranger. So, what initially inspired you to write that book? Was there a specific moment or experience that sparked the idea, or is it just something that's always intrigued you?
Yeah, so it's funny. I was raised in a family of funeral directors, and those are very social people to begin with. But my parents were always like fairly notorious about talking to strangers. So they would be like the sort of people that in a restaurant would like lean across three tables to ask someone a question, but also pull it off without just making everyone angry at them. So growing up, like I got to see people living life like that, right? So they're making friends, they're chatting with people all the time. And I grew up and I went into journalism, and journalism is you're just talking to strangers all the time too. So it seemed totally natural to me, and I had a lot of experiences that really bore out the idea that this is important. A lot of like chance encounters and connections made and opportunities and stuff like that. But a few years ago, I realized that I had stopped doing it. Like I used to talk to people a lot in bars and coffee shops, and just kind of see what's out there. And I had sort of stopped doing it. So I realized that, I would go to a bar and I'd be staring at my phone, which is like the lamest thing ever. Or I would be like deliberately avoiding the line in the pharmacy with a human at the end of it in order to do the self checkout thing. So like all this stuff, right? I didn't decide to do it. I just sort of like defaulted out of it. And so I missed those chance interactions because I had had a lot of a lot of very interesting conversations with people, and a lot of formative experiences of my life kind of came out of those random connections. So I started to wonder what stopped me from doing it. And, at that point in time, we had a very young daughter. And so, when you have a young kid, that'll take you off the board for a while. You're not social, you're not hanging around with people as much, you're tired. And talking to strangers involves like energy, right? So I think that was part of it. And then the other thing was just the phone. When you have a phone and you're of a certain privileged class, you can go the rest of your life without ever talking to a stranger again, right? So those two things combined, but then I just became curious, like, what are the benefits? Like, what are the reasons? What are the other reasons people don't talk to strangers? What are the benefits of doing it? How does it play into human history? How does it play into the way we live in cities? All these questions. And those led me down 1,000 different rabbit holes. And after a few years of research, I came up with the book.
From that, I would ask, in your book, if you could summarize why you believe connecting with strangers is so crucial, especially now when we seem to do it less than ever.
Yeah, there's so many benefits, and these were demonstrated in a lot of psychology studies, a lot of anthropological studies, and across disciplines. There's a great deal of evidence to suggest that these are really beneficial. So I'll start you out with like the psychology findings. Over the last 15 years or so, psychologists have started to study this, and what they've found is that talking to strangers, and even like the dreaded small talk about weather conversation, even just like a passing encounter like that, these don't have to be super deep conversations, leave people feeling happier. They have an enhanced sense of well-being. They feel more connected to their communities. The world seems less chaotic and scary. They have a better opinion of humanity, right? Because these, contrary to our bias against strangers, these interactions do tend to go pretty well. They feel less lonely. There's evidence that suggests that contact with strangers who are different than you are can alleviate prejudice. It can alleviate bias. People of different races, genders, meaningful contact with those people can actually go a long way. And we're now seeing those studies replicated over and over and over again in different cultures, different people across a range of ages. And you're seeing it over and over and over again that people, they'll sign up for these studies. They'll be told what to do, which is they're going to go on a bus or they're going to go around somewhere and they're going to talk to people. And then they're asked how it's going to go. And every single time they predict it's going to be a total disaster, right? Everybody's going to think that they're nuts, they're dangerous, no one behaves this way. And almost uniformly, the results have been positive. So these studies, people go out predicting the worst, and almost every single one of them has a positive experience doing it. And so I went through all those studies. I went through all the survey data, which is like the interviews with the subjects after the fact. And there's just an overwhelming sense of like relief that they weren't all axe murdered because they talked to a random stranger. I mean, you're in the UK, I'm in the US. The Americans were pretty aggressively poisoned against strangers for a long time with the like quote unquote stranger danger campaigns. But all those, we've seen those benefits again and again and again in studies. But for me, one of the more interesting findings, and this is the result of reading across a lot of disciplines and doing a lot of just, like field work myself. I talked to so many people doing this book, is that I think it's impossible to be a wise person without talking to as many people as possible. I think it's impossible to be truly worldly if you are only gaining your ideas about what people are from like the internet, media. And I say this as like a member of the media, right? If all your information, all your data about people is coming from like the news and Twitter, you're going to have a really negative perception of what people are like. And that's going to hurt, right? That's going to dissuade you from making friends. It's going to dissuade you from putting yourself out there and making the connections that a social creature needs to make. So, both from like a mental health perspective, but also like a broader wisdom perspective and worldliness perspective, I think it's enormously important.
You mentioned there that humans are inherently social creatures, but there are obviously people who would reckon or say that they're a lone wolf and they don't want that kind of interaction. Are they in the wrong there, or is that a preference people can have, or do you think it's more like they've never been taught how to make those connections in the first place, and then they need to be shown that it's not necessarily a bad thing, they don't have to do everything themselves?
Yeah, I mean, you hit on the big question. That's it. As a species, we're extremely social, right? Like even in the context of the natural world, like humans are remarkably social. You don't see a lot of animals that are as social as we are. You don't see a lot of animals that are even capable of like communicating or cooperating with strangers. And we do it every time we get on the subway. We do it all the time. We should give ourselves more credit for it. But as far as what's happened over the last few years, you've seen the advent of digital technology and communications technologies that's made it very easy to communicate without being in person, right? It's made it more efficient. It's made it faster. It's made it easier. And so people have naturally gone in that direction. They've moved a lot of their communications onto digital platforms. And in the process of doing that, your social skills erode a little bit. Those muscles soften, right? Those social muscles that we're born to have. Like we need them. They help us make friends. They help us make the connections we need to make. And then you see a cycle, and I've talked to a lot of experts about this as well, where, the pandemic aggravated this, but I think it was underway, where people withdraw a little bit and they're having fewer like improvised random interactions with people. They start to feel insecure. They start to feel incompetent, that they're not going to be able to do it. There's a lot of research on that one of the big reasons why people don't talk to strangers is because they think they're going to be bad at it. And the less you do it, the more it's going to seem true that you're bad at it, right? And then that's going to keep you from trying it. You're never going to build those muscles up again. So it's possible that people believe that that's what they want, right? Because it's easier. There's less friction. There's less stress. It can be challenging to talk to a new person. It can be cognitively demanding. And so I think we're mistaking the ease of digital communication with like the healthfulness of digital communication, I guess. Because what we're seeing now is that, people are very lonely. The rates of loneliness are very high. Rates of mental illness are very high. And that happened at the same time that people withdrew from the company of others. So, teenagers are spending so much less time in the company of peers than previous generations did. And adults are doing it too. Everybody's doing it. It's not just a young person problem. And that's a problem, right? I think people need to make the connection between that sort of withdrawal and how they feel. Do you feel good? Do you feel happy? Do you feel connected to your community, or do you not? Because if you don't, it means that this isn't, while this seems easy in the short term, it's actually going to create a lot of problems in the long term.
Absolutely. I guess it's just people taking the least path of resistance, especially.
Yeah. And that's adaptive, right? Like that's what, if an animal figures out a way to get food easily, it'll just get the food that way. Like we're wired for efficiency, and it's because it saves energy, right? It makes things faster. It makes it easier to get things, but that doesn't always work in our favor.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk a little bit as well about the historical importance of interacting with strangers and how it contributed to just human nature in general. So from that point, where did this lack of trust in strangers come from? I know you spoke a little bit like how we always saw stranger danger, but where did that come from, and then how could that be rectified?
Yeah, it's interesting because we're very social, but that doesn't mean we're like blithely walking into crowds of strangers and like trusting them, right? We're very social, but we're also careful. So we can be a little ambiguous about strangers. If we're competing with another group of people, if there's, scarce resources, then we can very easily throw a switch that allows us to dehumanize other people, right? If we feel like we're under threat, we can very easily not recognize the common humanity of the people that we're dealing with. And so that's always been a feature. One of the most interesting things in the anthropological research is that you saw traditional societies which you would think they would be more likely to distrust and fear strangers, right? Because I think there's this mistaken belief that we are xenophobic first and social second, right? It's actually kind of the opposite. But what they would do is, instead of just killing every stranger they saw or chasing people away or remaining isolated, they saw the benefits, the marriage benefits, the economic benefits, the kind of intelligence benefits almost of interacting with different people. But they also knew you couldn't just blunder up to people because you could get into trouble. So they devised all these things that anthropologists call greeting rituals, which are like rituals that allowed them to make sure that a stranger was safe and find a way to like safely incorporate them into the group. And these sprung up all over the world independent of one another. But it was like, a way to be like, we're safe. Are you safe? We're going to take a little risk. We're going to come out to you. We're going to stand there. If that goes okay, we're going to walk back a little bit. But it was like these stages that strangers would go through in order to interact with groups. So for many, many years, people have found ways to do this. They've found ways to get past their, like natural skepticism and fear of other people and develop positive relationships with them. But stranger danger as like a moral panic, as like a media event, which it basically was just pushing that button, the fear button, right? And we see this in our politics and we see it all over the place, where we do have that capacity to be afraid of strangers, to be naturally suspicious of strangers. And when you have someone who's deliberately pushing that button, right? I call it the them button sometimes. They're doing this, they're trying to take this, they're coming for your children, whatever. It'll make people crazy. You're right. And so that's what the stranger danger thing was. It was based on basically one child abduction case. And people just kept pushing it, that fear button, and eventually poisoned like an entire culture against people they didn't know. And now there's a little bit of research showing that may have actually harmed the sense of general social trust that young people feel towards people around them, right? Which is what happens when you tell children that everyone they don't know is going to kidnap them. Right? It's not a super healthy message for kids because we need each other. We need to live together. So it's basically like a new media-driven way to push a button that's been with us for a very long time. And what I hope to do with this book is both to nod to the xenophobic part of humanity, but also give a little more attention to the social part, the pro-social part, the circumstances under which we can safely and productively interact with people and make those sorts of social connections.
Yeah, I think it's just a case of finding a balance. And I think a lot of people might struggle to find that balance because obviously there's a case of being too trusting is never always the best idea either. So is there like a viable, obvious way to find that balance between interacting with strangers enough and then not overstepping that mark too much?
Yeah, you learn by doing it, right? So if you get into the habit of doing it, and again, like you don't have to spend a lot of time at this. You just inquire about the cashier at the store. How's he doing? And really ask a question and just see what they say. You don't need to go on forever. It is possible to have like longer, deeper conversations with strangers, which I've certainly done that too. But just joking around with someone in a store, things like that that goes a long way. And in time, you figure it out. You learn to be, you're a little quicker on your feet. You're more observant. You're seeing people's body language. You're aware of how you're coming across, all these factors. There's so many moving pieces in these interactions. But, don't give someone your credit card information. You have to be a little street smart about it. Do it in a safe place. Do it in a well-lit place with people around. There are precautions that are wise to take when people are doing this. Be mindful if you're just chatting with someone of the opposite sex in a bar because the signals might get crossed. But once you do start doing it, and this is interesting too because a lot of young people have said this in studies, but also people I spoke to, that they are uncomfortable with this because they think they're going to be bad at it. Right? They hadn't done it that much. They're much more adept at digital platforms, digital platforms are great in a lot of ways. But when it comes to in-person interaction, there's a lot of social anxiety there. The good news is that people are they're so much better at this than they think they are. And when people are put into an experiment and sent out to just go talk to someone, again, they'll start out by saying, I'm so uncomfortable doing this, but then they'll come back and say, that was actually a lot easier than I thought. And the reason why is because this is our nature as a social creature. Our nature is to, when we feel safe, right, to reach out and interact with other people. And that's how you make friends, and that's how you meet romantic partners, and that's how you gain access to stories and information, and you learn about your world and everything.
I think one thing that a lot of young people may struggle with is that reducing that anxiety of making that initial, like saying something to someone. Do you have any practical, applicable steps that you could take to slowly overcome that social anxiety and get the ball rolling?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's a huge question. For one thing, I wrote about this in the book, but I went through I wrote the book from the perspective of someone who is profoundly uncomfortable having these interactions, because I wanted it to be accessible to everybody. So it's not just I'm a journalist. I know how to talk to people, but I wanted to break it down to the atomic level. And here are all the things that you need to do and think about, and here are the steps that you need to take. So in the book, there is a progression of steps that people can take to practice, right? And, one of those early steps would be put your phone in your pocket and just notice what's happening around you. Notice the people around you, wonder about them a little bit, you don't even have to talk to people. Just notice what they're doing and give it a little bit of thought, right? There's a little bit of research that shows that even if you do something that minimal, you will feel a little more connected to the people around you. You'll feel a little better, stronger sense of well-being and the like. And it's also fun. It's people watching, right? So you can start doing that. You can move on to making a little eye contact here and there with someone just to see how they react. And if they notice and they smile or whatever, just say, have a good day. Start really minimal. When you're ready to take the next step, the best way to do it is just, if you're in a restaurant and, the waiter comes over, just talk to the waiter. It's a completely safe context to do it. The conversation's not going to go on for 4 hours because the waiter's busy, right? So it's just little exchanges here and there. You get a little bit of their life story. I was in Ohio a couple of weeks ago, and we had a waitress who was she was like Amish, a lapsed Amish person, whose life was absolutely fantastic. Who, if we hadn't asked about her, we wouldn't have known. Would have just been the woman bringing us our drink. So practicing a little bit there can be, in those sorts of venues, can be really helpful and get your confidence up and kind of dial you in a little bit so you can focus and you're paying attention and you're listening and you get comfortable with it. And then the other really fun thing, there was a woman named Georgie Nightingale. Or there is a woman named Georgie Nightingale. She's in London, and she's a genius. But she was giving classes on talking to strangers through an organization she runs called Trigger Conversations, and she has a lot of these great tricks that she uses to initiate conversations. And one of them is when you're in a store or in any sort of situation where you're dealing with a service employee, and they say, how are you? The tendency is to just be like, I'm fine, how are you? And you're not thinking, you're not listening, you're not talking. You don't honestly care what they're going to say. They don't care what you're going to say. It's just what they call a script, right? It would be weird not to say something, so we say this. This is the minimum. But you can, without spending any more time, you can turn those interactions, those scripted interactions, into actual little conversations. And one of the best ways Georgie came up with to do was, when they ask you, how are you, give them a numerical answer. So if they're like, how are you doing today? And you say, 6 out of 10, how are you? I've done this, Ishan, I've done this so many times at this point. They will give you a numerical answer back almost every single time. And now you're it's kind of like a little game. This is charming. It's a little audacious. They say, I'm an 8 out of 10. And then you can say well, what'll it take to get you to a 9 by the end of the day? And then they'll say something about their life. And now you've got a little tour of the life of someone else, right? You've humanized someone in a service position, which people are brutal to people who work those jobs, right? So they appreciate being actually talked to and engaged with, and not treated like, a service robot. And you get a little tour. It's like a little trip into the life of somebody else. And you get the benefits that psychologists are finding about feeling more connected, feeling less lonely, feeling more optimistic, that sort of thing. And, sometimes those conversations lead to deeper conversations. Where you learn more about the life of other people. And, to go back to my previous point, you just can't be a fully mature and wise person unless you take an interest in the lives of people around you and you understand that they're complex and they're different from you, right? And one of the really fun things related to that when it comes to just talking to people is they will unfailingly defy your initial perception of who they are, right? So, we can all do this. We can spot someone and say, this is what kind of person they're going to be. This is how they'll answer this question. And then you ask them that question and it will come from a completely different direction. And I think that's really healthy. And that's a really beneficial thing for society to, reduce the possibility of pigeonholing people and stereotyping people, right? To allow for the complexity of people and allow yourself to be surprised by it on a regular basis is enormously important, but also super interesting and really fun.
Yeah, I think a lot of those examples you gave are really good ways of breaking the ice or making yourself more comfortable with those kind of situations. But I would say, is there, once you're used to that initial conversation, how can you go from that to creating more meaningful and deeper interactions that lead to longer lasting relationships rather than just having the confidence to say something to anybody?
Yeah. I mean, well, you clearly are good at asking questions. So ask good questions, right? The funny thing is, like, the trick to talking to strangers is not talking, right? It's listening. So whatever people say, allow yourself to be surprised by it and actually listen to it, right? And from there, at least at the beginning of the conversation, you just ask basic journalism questions. So who, what, where, when, why, how. So when did that happen? Why did that happen? Who was that? Like, how did that make you feel? Those sorts of things. Really open-ended questions. And just let them go and follow them. And that's super uncomfortable for me as well, because I am like, when I'm in conversation, it's just the way I was raised and the people that I grew up with. Conversation was just like a rock fight, right? Like it was just a wrestling match. So it was a competitive sport. I grew up in Boston in the States. What you have to do is relinquish control, right? And this thing provokes a lot of anxiety for people because we're so accustomed to being in control of our interactions when you're like texting. And again, I love text. I love email. But when you're doing that, you're in control. You get to decide what you say. You get to take time to think about your response. You get to, wait 10 minutes to respond. You're not in a live fire situation. When you're talking to someone in person, you are in a live fire situation. So you really need to listen. You really need to listen to what they're saying. And then you have to be vulnerable enough to let them take you somewhere you didn't expect to go. And when you get used to that, that's when you end up hearing some really interesting things, right? You move beyond small talk. And you kind of facilitate, right? It's almost like a way of you just like allowing them to tell their story. And then just by the magic of human psychology, once, if two people are talking to each other and they're comfortable, when one makes like a personal disclosure, right? They say something personal. If they're both like, they're in it together and they're both comfortable, the other person will match that disclosure. So if someone says something about their parents, like, oh, we'll say something a little revealing about my parents. And what you see is like this dance happening where you're following each other into a deeper conversation. I think we've all been in that situation where it just clicks, right? You just have chemistry with someone and the conversation just goes in this, like, you're both very comfortable and it just goes much deeper than a small talk conversation. But the only way you're going to get that to happen is by listening and like relinquishing control and not doing the thing. And this is very important, not just searching what they say for something you want to talk about, right? And this is like, everybody does this. I do this. I still do it. But to be like, oh, what do you do? Where do you live? Like, you have a dog, blah, blah, blah. And you're just like fishing for something that's personally interesting to you, right? And it makes sense because that's where you're comfortable. But that's not what's going to lead to a better conversation. Better conversation is you just like feeding it and letting it go and just following it. And then in time, you will find you have lots in common because everybody has something in common with everybody else. And eventually you'll kind of catch up with each other. But to get it going, listening and open-ended questions are the way to do it.
Yeah, I think I feel like I'm pretty good at asking the questions that lead them to giving difficult questions. But I think like giving good answers, that means I get to know the person. But one thing I find myself that I do, I'm not sure whether it's good or a bad thing. It's not really a judgment, but I just notice I feel the need to like give my own anecdote that is similar to the thing they're saying, which is good in some contexts. But sometimes I do rather wish I'd just asked them more. Like a follow-on question from Rod they just said rather than go. So it would be like, oh, I went to the movies and blah, 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 blah. And sometimes I go, oh, I also saw that film too. And I thought this about it. And instead I should probably be like, so how did you feel? Like I think sometimes we have a tendency to always try and relate it back to ourselves, which can help the conversation flow sometimes. But other times maybe it's not the best idea to always bring an anecdote of something that's happened in your life back to you. And I think that's something that I do too often, and I'm trying now to consciously stop myself from doing that too much, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're talking about is something that everybody does, and it can actually be really valuable because what you're doing is showing that you have something in common. And again, because we're a social animal, when we do have conversations with new people, we should pause for a second and appreciate that our minds work this way, that we will automatically try to find the thing that we have in common. And when you talk for 5 minutes, like you'll find something you have in common, no matter who it is, like you'll always find something you have in common. So there is something good natured and social about when someone says they've been through something or they've experienced something to say that I have too, because it shows that like we can see eye to eye on this. We have a shared experience. And when you have a shared experience, it makes people more comfortable with each other. Now, if they're just like, I saw this movie the other night, and you say, I saw that too, and then you give like a 30-minute diatribe against the movie, that's not going to work. But checking in from time to time and being like, oh, okay, like here's something we have in common, just to let them know, that you are connected in some way. Like this is, when people become connected to each other, it's always like, they're like multiple tendrils, connecting. It's this, it's this, it's this. So yeah, don't be too hard on yourself for doing that. It's just a question of like, are you running away with the conversation? If that's the case, then it's not helping, but just like pointing out commonalities, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess it's just something that you learn over time. But
Yeah, you just can't don't filibuster. That's the thing. Avoid speeches.
Yeah, exactly. Don't ramble on for too long. But what is it specifically about our brains' chemistry or like psychology that makes us want to do that kind of relating immediately to the thing that someone's saying rather than just allowing them to speak?
Yeah, I think that's probably it's probably anxiety to a certain degree. We're very uncomfortable not talking sometimes. We're uncomfortable with silence. This is the thing that they train like reporters to do, is be comfortable with silence. So you just let someone talk and then don't jump all over them, just let them go. But it feels vulnerable. I don't know what the science would be on this necessarily, but people are anxious. People feel vulnerable when you're in those situations. And so I think it's probably those factors that play as much as anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just yeah, like a mix of not wanting to have it end or fizzle out or something. So you kind of just keep going on and on so then it keeps happening. Yeah. But another thing kind of similarly, I would say, is that as a guy, and as a lot of guys might understand, is that a lot of us don't do like vulnerability very well and don't like let anyone in too deep. So how can you balance that, being open and actually allowing people to like know you better whilst also maintaining that kind of personal boundary, especially for people who aren't very good at opening up to even the people they know, forget just a random stranger who maybe engage?
That's a fantastic question. Well, for starters, it doesn't have to be like a deeply revealing emotional conversation. You can connect over football, you can connect over whatever. The connection is the point, right? And sometimes for men, especially because many men are uncomfortable with like emotional disclosure, especially like right out of the gate, they'll find other things. They'll find clubs, they'll find sports, like the things that function as like the beginning of the relationship, and then the other stuff can follow later, right? So it's okay to be a little uncomfortable, but you don't have to force yourself to be like absolutely mortifying yourself with like total emotional disclosure. So you can be gentle with yourself. Like if there's a club, if there's a task that you're working on with someone, if it's a project, if you're playing on a team, like all these things are fantastic and they bond people to each other, for sure. But I think at a certain point, a relationship isn't going to, it's almost like, when a friendship forms without a little bit of emotional disclosure or vulnerability, like those are the things that bond us to each other, right? And they're really valuable because that other people have some of the same challenges that you have, right? Like one of the really striking things in reading the results of some of these studies that used college students was like this overwhelming sense of loneliness where so many kids thought that the problems that they had were only their problem, that no one else had these problems. And that will kill you, right? Like that belief will kill you, will drive you crazy. And so a lot of these kids went out and talked to people, and they were so relieved to discover that other people had similar problems to them. And so that only comes out as the result of some sort of emotional disclosure, talking about your difficulties. I do think there are certain differences between men and women that they just are real and they will persist. But something like that can be really helpful, right? To deepening relationships, that sort of thing, to at least putting yourself out there a little bit. I come from my father never had emotional conversations with me, but he definitely was like a storyteller. And so there are different ways of doing that. There are different ways of offering the deeper part of yourself without it just being like, let me tell you about all my sorrows. Because if you're too abrupt with that sort of thing too, like people just aren't going to want to really talk to you. you can't just go into a conversation and just like unload all of it because people will think that you have a screw loose. But there are different ways to connect. There are different ways to show parts of yourself that are the deeper parts that will help you foster those connections with people.
Do you think those kind of connections with strangers specifically, and in the studies that you did look at, did it contribute to people's personal growth and self-development and discovery of their own character? Did people find that they were more understanding in how they felt in themselves by doing these kind of interactions?
Yes. Yeah, it's hard to measure because it's also subjective, but there's a psychologist named Arthur Aaron who's done a lot of work on this, and his idea is this idea of self-expansion. And so self-expansion is just personal growth, right? Like you go on a trip and it's meaningful, like you take that with you, right? You have a job and it's meaningful, or if it's horribly difficult or whatever, like that all goes into you. That makes you who you are, and your relationships are like that too. All these, you contain all this stuff. And so when you do have a notable experience, or you do make a new friend, or there's some sort of interaction that really stays with you, that becomes part of who you are. So I think it does probably clarify your sense of self because you have a much better understanding of humans, and you have a better understanding of where you're unique and where you're not unique, which is very useful, right? So a lot of difficulties that you have might be very common difficulties, and you'll only learn about that if you talk to people. And then there might be some things about you that are genuinely unique, and you'll only know that if you have like a data set to compare it against, and that's talking to strangers. But yeah, that answer your question? Lost my out there a little bit.
It's all right. It's like quite an open-ended question anyway. Like, I don't think there's not really a definite answer. It's more just like as a point to make in terms of self-discovery. I guess it's like something that's very personal to every individual, and I think for some people that ability to like talk to strangers might unlock something in them when they go, that's like what I was missing. Like I was just isolating myself because I was scared, I was worried, but now I'm not scared and worried anymore. And I think that's what I meant by it. Was it found that that is the case? But I guess that is like
it's tough to measure. I mean, it's going to be anecdotal. People, I certainly heard that from a lot of people, both scientists and just from like advocates for doing this. But it reminds me, and I think I used this metaphor before, but it reminds me of travel, right? Like travel in a way, you'll learn who you are when you travel. When you put yourself in completely alien environment that you're not comfortable with and you don't know the folk ways, and you figure it out, that will help you grow, right? And you'll take that experience with you forever, and you'll take a certain measure of confidence from doing it too, because you did something difficult and you can do that again, and you can probably do more difficult things. So you can apply that to just being social, where you get a better sense of your capabilities, right? By practicing this, you get a much better sense of how good you can be at connecting with people, in addition to just the benefits of connecting with people, right? You'll become more worldly and wise, you'll make more friends, but you will have the confidence, right? And you'll be able to travel in that way. You'll be able to travel through the lives of others because you're comfortable enough interacting. And I think that's pretty profound. And, I certainly heard a lot about that and experienced that myself over the process of doing this.
Were there any specific stories or anecdotes or things like that particularly stuck in your memory that when you researched the book that you thought, that's like a cornerstone thing that I can base some of my points around?
Yeah. I mean, I did a fair amount of travel for this. So I went to like Finland, which the Finns think they're the worst in the world at talking to strangers. And I think they might be, but they're very nice. Hung out there with like an English professor from Oxford, who was trying to teach the Finns to talk to strangers because they had an influx of immigrants, and it was like cracking the society because the Finns just aren't social. So it's hard for them to like absorb new people in a way that like the UK is much better at it and the US is much better at it because we've been doing it for centuries. But yeah, putting myself in different cultures like that was really useful, and seeing how like different norms form and how people are socially and what causes those things, right? But there is like one anecdote that I go back to a lot, where I was in Boston and I called an Uber, got into the Uber, and the driver had like Starburst candy, which I hadn't seen since I was like a kid. And so I was like, oh, you have Starburst candy? And he was like, yeah, I tried some other things and nobody really liked it, but they seem to like this. And so I just started asking this guy about himself. And he ended up being one of the most interesting people I've ever met, who I'm still friends with today. But he was in the middle of, he was transitioning. So born female, identified as male, but like transitioned in middle age, but lived this incredible life, like grew up in dire poverty in the South in America, lived all over the country, started all these little businesses, became involved in a public health effort in Gulu in Uganda, met a kid who was covered with burns from like a rebel attack in Uganda, spent 10 years trying to get medical help for this kid. It was just an incredible odyssey. And this conversation came as a result of me asking about the candy that he had in the car. And it was so interesting that I just ended up like, I got his phone number, I called him later, interviewed him. I couldn't fit him in the book because the story was so involved that it would have taken up like 40 pages. But we've been good friends, but just like an absolutely fascinating person from a completely different world than me, who just has this incredible life and is very cool and fun to hang out with and talk to. But I always think about that, every time I get a text from him or something, that only happened because I asked about the can. Right. So this is what I mean by like, we probably have a fairly dim opinion of like taxi drivers, or we don't think to talk to them or whatever it is. But this is like this random person who just like picked me up one day, had this incredible life story that I'll probably carry with me for the rest. And I had a few of those interactions, but they only happen when you put yourself out there. But when you do, I think people will be pretty pleased by the result.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a case of just putting yourself out there, even though you might think that the conversation is benign and maybe not going to go anywhere. It's worth that conversation could definitely make someone's day, even though they don't realize. You might not think it's anything significant, but maybe they've been a taxi driver, for example, and no one's even bothered to interact with them for the last 2 weeks or something like that.
Yeah. So it's good for them and it's good for you.
Yeah, and another thing I was thinking in kind of the opposite, like inverse of that, is there anything in your research that you found that was like counterintuitive that you initially didn't think would be true, like that you found about how humans interact with strangers that really surprised you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, going into it as a journalist, I was, my perception of humanity was not super positive. It was a little cynical, a little pessimistic. And I went to it thinking that being social was going to be an exception, that the norm, like our default, was that we were going to be assholes. And when I got into the research, like discovering that, it's more common that we're social, right? Like our tendency is to be social. We have a capacity for evil. We have a capacity for xenophobia. We have a capacity for dehumanization, but the default is pretty social. And when you look at human history, it's remarkable that we've done this. If you put 100 chimpanzees in a subway car, like it will be a massacre, right? And yet humans can ride in a subway car and generally be fine with each other. They might be a little grouchy, but they're fine. But I think what I thought going into it was that cultures where people are friendly to each other, where people are what they call xenophilic, right? Which is where you like favor contact with strangers. You try to talk to everybody. And, those places are around like Brazil is like that. Like the Mediterranean can be like that, where people will like seek out conversations with strangers. I think I thought at first that was the result of them just thinking people are good, that they're safe, that they're fun, that we should be talking to everyone. And they just had a very positive attitude. But when you look at the cultural evolution that created those conditions, it was always the opposite. It was always like a strained place, a place with a lot of friction, a place that might have some conflict, a place with like a lot of diversity that made it difficult for people to communicate with each other. Loving people didn't make us social. Friction made us social. Being social was a way to deal with friction. It was a way to deal with both like, in deep history, pooling resources to get food, building social networks so you can survive. But in more recent history, it's a very practical thing. So having social skills is a very practical thing. I was talking to a sociologist in Mexico, and she was just saying, like Mexico is very social because you can't rely on the government. You need to rely on each other. So even to just get your driver's license is like a pain in the ass, and you have to know this process and know this guy, and this guy will introduce you to this guy, but it's like a fundamentally social way of life. Whereas you look at Finland, the government is so efficient and so effective that no one ever really has to be social, right? Like it's just everything is smooth. There's no violence. There's no strain. Everything's pretty easy. Like the place is very healthful and clean. But as a result, they're socially inept because they don't have the practice, right? And so it's interesting to see cultures that became social because people were worried about each other, because people didn't trust each other necessarily, or that the world was chaotic. And so they've sort of banded together in order to cope with it. And just, cultures of friendliness is just a kind of like a feature of that endured even after the threat or the difficulty had passed.
Ah, okay. That makes sense. So it's almost as if like less developed, more tumultuous countries, people are arguably more friendly because they need to find that ally who's going to help them through that tough time, rather than if you're in that comfortable position where literally everything's perfect, you don't feel the need to seek it out in the first place because they're not going to add any value to you other than like a short conversation. But
you don't need it. Right. Yeah. And you see that with affluence too, where there's studies showing that affluent people are less social than like working class people. That's because they don't need help, right? They can just pay for everything they need. Whereas working class people need to pool resources. They need to help each other out. There's a really interesting body of work on what, I guess this would be sociology, but what they call smiling cultures. And these are cultures that literally people laugh and smile more than they do in other cultures. And the idea behind that, and this, like a lot of Latin America would be like this, like Rio turns up a lot. Brazil turns up a lot. It's just a super friendly place. But what researchers discovered was that those cultures resulted from hundreds of years of immigration, right? So these were cultures where people were pouring in from all over the place for many, many years. And the smiling and laughing thing that was like a very practical way of dealing with communication difficulties with people who are different than you are, who might not speak the same language, who might not have the same cultural norms. And so if you're in Finland and you meet another Finn, like you both know you're Finns and everything, you speak the same language, you don't need to worry about it. But if you don't know if someone understands you, or you need to signal to them that you're trustworthy, that they don't have to fear you, that you don't have to fear them, that's when the eyebrows go up and you're waving and you're smiling and you're gesturing. So smiling cultures are places where people are very attuned to each other emotionally, but also very extroverted because they just need to demonstrate quickly, like, I am okay, I'm not going to hurt you, I'm smiling, right? That doesn't mean these places are safer. It doesn't mean that they're more stable. It's just how people are. But they are that way as a practical response to the problem of tons of immigration over the century. It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I guess that is quite surprising initially, but when you think about it, on the surface it's surprising, but actually when explained like that, it becomes makes more sense. But I guess in more Western, more modern, more privileged societies, do you find that there's a bit of, especially maybe with your book or people who you discuss this with, where you tell people things like talk to strangers is a good thing, do you find that you encounter some skepticism and resistance, and then how do you respond to that kind of concern?
Yeah, the resistance is always relates to crime. So I hear a lot from people saying that they're like, they want to do this, but they're anxious, right? And so that's totally normal. That's, that you can just point to the evidence that says, like, you just try it and it'll probably go well for you. But I get a lot of hysterical emails sometimes from people just saying that, like, I'm the friend of like child abductors, because if we let children talk to strangers, they're all going to be taken away by this like shadowy network of child abductors, or they're going to be murdered, or we're going to be murdered, or it always comes down to fear of strangers. And that can be fear of strangers as a general category. It can be attached to certain groups of strangers, but it comes up a lot. I don't know if I can what I usually do is just send crime statistics to people, right? So when someone, like this happened last week, where someone sent me an email saying, like, I'm sure the child abductors are going to be happy to read your book. I'd sent them the FBI data on child abductions, which is the vast, vast majority of child abductions are done by family members, right? And the number of strangers who've abducted children is tiny. I mean, it's statistically almost insignificant. So I'll be polite. I'll send that along. I don't know if it does any good. No one ever responds. So I think it's almost part of their politics or part of their personal philosophy that they need to believe that that's the case in order to justify other beliefs, possibly. It's, more complicated than I'm able to get into. But yeah, you definitely get pushback. But, for a lot of people, it's just, this is a mortifying prospect to do this. I'm very nervous doing this. It's going to go badly. People are going to think there's something wrong with me. But you see time and time again that it does tend to go pretty well.
Yeah, I guess especially now with technology and social media and things like that, I think there needs to be a distinguishing between like talking to a stranger who's like a cashier or something, or like someone that you meet on the street, rather than like a 15-year-old would now might like just send a DM to a stranger and equivocate it as the same thing, and that level of confidence might be there because they're behind a screen. So I guess maybe in terms of someone who's like a parent, for example, that might be a reason why they have that level of pushback, because it's not only in person speaking to someone, it's more that digital space that seems more unsafe because people can hide behind that kind of mask.
Yeah, for sure. It is possible to have like real connections with people online, but it's much more complicated because all the rules that govern human interactions in person are just gone on the internet, right? Like when you're around someone, you're looking at each other like their humanity is undeniable, right? It's very difficult to just like say something super rude to a person to their face, because you're either going to get beaten up or you're going to see that you've hurt them, right? Whereas on the internet, you can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. They're not real people. It's like a video game. But, to that point, like, I don't want to come off like a Luddite. There's a lot of technology I love that I think has been a boon. But my fear, and I saw myself going this way too, is again, like if your perception of people is based on what's coming through social media and what's coming through the news, right? Or cultural sources, you're going to have a negative perception of people. So it's almost like getting better data to go out into the world and talk to people in person and get a more nuanced take of what people are like, what motivates them, what their experiences are, just to balance it out. Again, like social media can be fantastic in a lot of ways, but it's good to get like dip into a different data set every once in a while to get a more, more nuanced perception of what we are as a species.
Absolutely. I think, again, it's just a case of finding that level of comfortability with people interacting online, but also not being overly naive, in the sense that, I guess for teenagers, it's more difficult in the sense that they don't realize kind of the difference. But obviously you don't have that level of like social cues, like body language, facial expressions, things like that on social media. But as a young person, you might not be able to tell the difference just because you're hyper-stimulated and you're like, oh, this is really fun being able to just talk to anybody. So I guess that level of concern is understandable, but I think it's just an educational thing where it's like it's explained in a way that's not too, I don't know how to put it. It's not overly exaggerated, like I'll just talk to anybody, but it's not a fear. It's just like be aware that bad things do happen, but as long as you're like vigilant and not overly naive, you'll be fine.
Yeah. And again, like nothing bad comes from paying more attention to people, right? So even if you're watching people and they do something bad, like you've watched them do it, you've learned the warning signs. And I hadn't seen in none of the studies I read did anything bad happen to anyone who went out to talk to strangers as part of these studies. But there's a huge benefit to just paying attention to the people around you, right? You become more worldly, you become more streetwise, and if there are danger signs, you'll be better at reading them if you have a lot of interactions with people than if you don't, right? You'll just learn to read people a lot better because you'll be around them a lot.
And in terms of your experiences, is there anything that you learned from that research or from doing more interactions with strangers that has improved or applied more to your daily life in general?
Yeah, it honestly made me feel better about people, which I think is a big deal, right? Especially at a time like this, very cynical time, very scary time in a lot of ways. It's enormously reassuring for me to go to get a pint at a bar and like talk to the bartender, and the bartender has some really funny story or is like surprising or interesting, and the person next to us like gets involved and you have a little conversation, you go home, right? It's all those little interactions are usually reassuring. Partly because we're so pessimistic about the people around us that when they aren't monsters, we're like, oh great, what a good guy. He didn't throw me in a bag and throw me in the back of a van. That's like the value to me, right? You can almost like fill that up, like a little bit of optimism. That by going out, having a good talk, like you don't have to worry about that person necessarily, right? You have to worry about the small group of people, and then you generalize from there. And like, if that was such a fascinating little conversation, then there must be other fascinating conversations to be had. And it's just a way to check your pessimism, right? To check despair. And, a certain amount of despair is warranted at this point. We're at a tough moment in history. And so I'm not asking everyone to just be like, people are wonderful all the time. Like, understand what you're dealing with here, but there is grounds for, I believe, more optimism than people are willing to express.
There's a cynical mindset that I think a lot of people get stuck in, especially I'm British, that is like the standard mode. Mm-hmm. We assume we just start off as like a cynical level, and then you gain the trust from there, I guess. So yeah. I think one thing I would say to just help round off like what you've said is there anything that you can do on like a daily basis to help implement this ability to get more comfortable with talking to strangers that people can implement into their lives? Yeah,
just like I said earlier, easy wins. So every time you go out, when you're walking down the street, put the phone down and just like look at the people around you and think about them, wonder about them, and notice things about them. And then when you're in very structured little interactions, like you're buying something at the store, you're getting coffee, ask the person a question about themselves. Ask them how they're doing and actually listen to the answer. That sort of thing. Just little bits. It's like reps. It's like doing exercise. Find your little opportunities, do them, build up your confidence, build up your kind of quick-wittedness. And then from there, you can go a little further, and you can go a little further out of your comfort zone. But just, finding those opportunities and being present in the world, just noticing what's happening around you will go a long way.
Joe, of course you have your book, The Power of Strangers, but as well as that, where can people find you if they want to hear more of your stuff?
Yeah, you can. I have a website. It's joekeohane.net. There's more information there. My email's there if anyone's got any good stories or anything. I'm always around. And I also wrote a novel. I co-wrote a novel called The Lemon that came out 2 years ago under the name S.E. Boyd. And we're developing that for television now. So that's what I've been doing lately is developing this TV show. But yeah, people should check that out too.
The link to the book will be in the show notes as well.
Great.
So, Joe, you've been an incredible guest, and you've had some really amazing insights into the importance of talking to strangers. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Sean. It was great talking to you. You asked great questions too.